Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Jason Buchovecky, and we'll be talking about wilderness safety. And the big thing here is that, well, let's just get started with this. One of the things that I think about with wilderness safety, and this talk in particular, is going to be the thoughtfulness of wilderness safety. We can talk about a lot of different things. We can create, not a checklist, but we can look at different ways to go about wilderness safety. What I want to do is emphasize that it's a thoughtful process and how that looks. So before we get into all that stuff, let's talk a little bit about me. It's all about me. I am a nurse up at the hospital. I work in the emergency department. I've been a nurse, this is my 10th year starting now. And with that job, I had also done for a couple years, about 3, the emergency preparedness coordinator, which I'll explain in a moment. If you go back in my history, I've been teaching since about when I was 18, and I also worked as an instructor for the National Outdoor Leadership School for 15 years. If you're not aware or know of the National Outdoor Leadership School, it's an outdoor school. We teach mostly, we teach anything from 2-week to multi-month courses. We teach a variety of information. You can pick a particular skill like mountaineering or boating or something and a place. You can put those 2 things together and go do it. So you can do mountaineering in Patagonia or mountaineering in the Wyoming or different places, same kind of thing. As an instructor there, you'll see that a lot of my views on wilderness safety come from that experience. So as an instructor, I had over 200 weeks in the field, which meant I was sleeping on the ground for over 4 years of my life. So in a tent on the ground. I was proud of it at one point. Now I have a sore back. And the thoughtfulness that came from that was all related to being with groups. And so I was leading groups. So as a troop leader, I had a certain process. For this talk, I've taken that information, and I'm not going to talk directly about group stuff or commercial trips, but we're going to talk more about being out in the wilderness, in the woods, on your own or with a group of friends. I also worked for many first aid organizations. So Knowles had WMI, Wilderness Medicine Institute, and I taught first aid classes for them. I also worked for RMI and a couple other groups teaching wilderness first aid. Said I'd get back to the emergency preparedness coordinator. What's interesting is all the stuff that I did in the wilderness was able to cross over into this emergency preparedness coordinator. And if you're not sure what that is, in cities, we have folks that look at what if something big happened? What if we had an earthquake or a volcano eruption or something? And how would we deal with that? Flooding or fires or otherwise. And so the hospital is a part of that. And so I was the emergency preparedness coordinator for the hospital, and we would look at how were we prepared for these different things to happen? How would we change our daily operation instead of dealing with the 60 to 80 patients a day that we normally see? What if we had 50 come into us within 2 hours, right? We have to change our way of thinking about that. And so what was really interesting to me is all this experience that I had, especially, and it's all related to the safety, thinking about safety, played into this position. So what this is, we're going to talk about safety. We're going to talk about it as a thoughtful process. I want to open up people's eyes to this if this is something new to you. If it's not something new to you, I want to hopefully give you some understanding of, or a different perspective that you might have otherwise had. So one of the things living in Bozeman, I realized lots of people have tons of outdoor experience, which is great. And so I like to sometimes find those things that you might not have thought about. This is not first aid class. It's not a checklist. I'll talk about that in a second though. It's not a certification, and again, as I said earlier, I'm not going to talk about the commercial side of things. That has its own legal ramifications that we're not going to deal with here. Real quick on checklists, they're actually a great safety tool. I just don't happen to be focused on that in this talk. Does that make sense? If you've heard about aviation safety and all the things that go into that, checklists are a very important part of that. In this case, I'm going to talk more about the thoughtfulness in the big picture. So, in order to talk about wilderness safety, we have to define two things, wilderness and safety. My next slide is going to say defining wilderness. Anyone want to throw out an idea of wilderness definition?
Any place outside the city limits.
Any place outside the city limits. Okay. There's a lot of wilderness in Montana.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
A place inaccessible to emergency rescue or quick emergency rescue.
Okay.
Something like our communication with an emergency.
Yeah, and you're hitting on some interesting points. There's this idea that it's harder to get help.
Right.
It's harder to communicate. So there are some definitions out there. Now notice the first one up there, it's wilderness medicine. It's not wilderness safety. Has anyone heard this one before? Greater than an hour to definitive care?
Yeah.
Okay. A couple things with that. That was the standard. That's what we talked about in all these classes that I taught. And in the last couple editions of some of the big, I'll call them the wilderness medicine Bibles, they've actually dropped that out. They've said, you know what, that's nice and all, it fits kind of, but we're going to focus on something else. And one of the issues there is it's all about time and not about place. And there are a lot of places in Montana where you are greater than an hour from definitive care, but you're at someone's house. Or, you know, like I did a lot of hunting this year south of Glasgow, just on there's a giant lake there and I just forgot the name of it. Anyone? It's part of a river, dammed up. Fort Peck, thank you. Occasionally I lose things. I'm back. That's a remote area, especially if the roads get wet and then they turn to the gumbo and all that other stuff. Okay. Cool little side note. International Space Station. Would you consider that a remote place?
Yes.
Yep. How long do you think, if they had an emergency, now they have lots of setups where they can communicate with them and they have lots of supplies up there to help medically, but if they had a medical emergency for one of the astronauts, how long to get them to Earth?
2 weeks.
Weeks, months?
They have some sort of skate pod or something?
In a good day, 90 minutes.
Wow.
Yep. Now, I'd heard shorter than that, but I wanted to check myself. We're doing this talk, so I went on, and there are, you know, the NASA website, you can check a lot of different stuff. And it said that this current escape pod, as you said, about 90 minutes if everything lines up. Because you have to make sure that when you pop the button, that wherever they circle down to is going to land in the right place, which should be water. And then the cool part about the definitive care is that military we have has amazing definitive care that, I mean, basically they can show up with a helicopter, pick these people up, and give them the care that they need right then and there. Okay. I just love that fact for some reason. There's the dictionary, uncultivated, uninhabitable, and inhospitable region. That doesn't sound like very much fun, right? But we all go out into the wilderness and do stuff, and we enjoy ourselves. So I wasn't really sold on that. A retreat from civilization, that seems to fit for a lot of what we do in some ways. For tonight, what we're going to talk about is some combination of this. To me, it's more along the lines of what you said, which is outside of city limits. We want to think about, it's not in the backyard, it's outdoors. It's somewhere from that, when you show up at the trailhead to somewhere back in. And that can mean a lot of different things. And the reason that's important is because our safety in these areas, we need to take that into consideration. It's one thing if I'm at the M and on that trail, and another thing if I go deep in to like the, what is that, the Chinese wall, did I say that right? In the Bob. That's a different set of, not responsibility, but there are different ways of thinking about my safety and being safe out there. So now we'll look at safety. So that's the definition of safe. Raise your hand if you agree with it. No one agrees with it. How about now? I got one hand, okay. 2 hands, okay. Here's the thing for me is I think of safe as being safe. I am protected from harm. what I thought was interesting is not likely to be harmed. So the definition of safe in itself says, hey, you're protected from most things, but you could get hurt anyway, right? And the reason that's important because we have to understand that wilderness safety in itself may be impossible to do. To be truly safe, you should stay home.
And then get hurt.
And even then, you can still get hurt, right? And so what we want to look at is there's an inherent risk. And that inherent risk is important. So we've defined that the area we're talking about, wilderness, is really outdoors and outside of the city, so out on a trailhead somewhere, and it can be a lot of different things. And the safety part is the idea that we're going to have an inherent risk, which we'll talk about here in a moment. And how do we take that and deal with it to be as safe as it can be for us doing these activities or otherwise? Does that make sense? So of course, we have to have a test. Let's see if I remember, because I hid the questions from myself. Those are the answers. First question. No, now I have to remember things. The number of motor vehicle crash fatalities in Montana per 100,000 people in 2016.
39.
What's that?
39.
39? Any other guesses?
It's the only one without a decimal. You can't have a partial death.
Well, per 100,000, you can't, because it's per 100,000.
I'm going
But that's a great thing.
18.2.
18.2. How about, this is where it'll pay off, what your thought there will pay off on this one. Number of deaths due to lightning strikes in 2000. So just the straight number of deaths in the US due to lightning strikes.
39.
Thank you. Okay. And so then if you look at the national average, or not at national average, the national number for the 2016, so we were slightly higher per 100,000. And then that's what it turns out to be if you do per 100,000 in the USA for lightning deaths. Now, why did I do this when I talk about inherent risk? Well, there's inherent risk in everything that we do. There's some kind of risk. And so when we talk about driving a vehicle around, we know that there's an inherent risk with that, and that there are deaths that can occur. Death is not the only risk, and so there's also injuries and other things that can happen. But we can see that I'm scared of lightning because I had a bad experience, so that's why I chose lightning as my thing here. But it's far more dangerous in my mind, in some ways, for me to get in the car to drive to work, back and forth to work, than it is to worry about being struck by lightning in the wilderness. But that is kind of on a day-to-day basis. What about when I'm stuck on the ridge because I made the poor decision to go up and not down when there was a storm going and I'm fully exposed up high in the lightning storm? Do you think that number still fits there? No, because it's talking about everyone in the US in their houses and everywhere else, whether or not they were struck by lightning. I would love to see the number of people that were exposed in the wrong place that were struck by, you know what I mean, the ones that weren't versus the ones that were. So there's also, you have to put some thought into, when you start to look at these statistics and otherwise, what are we talking about? So with inherent risk, we know that there's a risk out there when we go outdoors. And we need to then figure out how do we deal with that risk so that we can travel safely. So there's a couple things we need to do. First, we need to recognize that risk. So at one point here, we'll have a slide, we'll talk about the various risks that are out there. So we have to recognize that there is a risk. And I know this sounds weird. You'd think that if I recognized it, that I've already acknowledged it or accepted it. But I feel that those are two different things, right? Because you can say, yeah, there's a risk, and at the same time you're like, but it'll never happen to me. That happens to other people, not me. And as soon as we do that, we're not truly accepting and acknowledging that risk. We have to go, yes, that can happen, and that could happen to me or us, depending on the group or otherwise. And we take that and we say, okay, I've recognized it, I've accepted it. Now I need to do something about it. What have I done to prepare for it? And that's what we're really going to talk about tonight. What are those things that we do once we recognize and acknowledge and accept those risks to plan and prepare? I said that I had a slide. It didn't appear to be the next one. So let's talk about you all telling me some inherent risks in, we'll say, backcountry travel or hanging out in the backcountry.
Bears.
So animals, there's a variety of them, right? Here, bears are the big one. Southwest, rattlesnakes or scorpions. And there's some scorpions up here, I've heard. Rattlesnakes, they're around. My dog's found a few, unfortunately. But she's good, she points them and then runs away. What else?
Accident.
Injury, personal injury.
Oh, right. So the risk of being injured just by doing stuff. So we can sprain an ankle, trip and fall, do those different things. What else?
Exposure.
Exposure, hypothermia, hyperthermia, and we can have both here, right? And so, what else? Water, yeah. And we have a lot of that around here.
Cardiac emergencies?
Yeah.
Cardiac, so back to the medical side of things, things that can just happen to us while we're out. Okay. There's a lot of different things out there. And you're going to see that we will acknowledge some of these as we go along. So this brings us to putting all that together and starting to think about, well, what does it mean to be safe in the wilderness? What does it mean about wilderness safety? To me, the biggest thing that we have to realize is it's a thoughtful process. I looked up a bunch of slogans about safety, and a lot of them come from mining, and a lot of them are actually, the ones that I saw came from the Colorado Mining Association. Safety doesn't happen by accident. Well, I like it, right? These are things, it's a very thoughtful process. It does not just happen to us. So when I was an instructor, the last 4 years at Knowles, I trained new instructors. So I do an instructor course twice a year. And one of the things that I did was I developed this, I'll call it a class. But what it was is I told myself and the two other instructors that were working the course that for one day, from the moment you woke up to the end of the day, you would speak out loud everything that you were thinking about for that day to the other instructors, to the students on the course. Because when you're out there and you're with someone experienced, it can look like they're not doing much when they're making the decisions, right? They can be out there, it's a switch of clothing, or they do something with their skis, or do something, but they're thinking about the big picture, and then they're making actual changes. And so what I wanted to do was show to this group of people that I'm actually thinking about a lot of stuff. And when I worked with groups, I was thinking about everyone else, including myself. So I thought about all the blisters that might be happening or not happening. If people fed and hydrated, how's that going to affect our hike? How's that going to affect, today's one thing, but 6 days from now I need to get to new groceries so that we can get resupplied and go on. There was all this level of thinking that went on about that safety for that day. That to me is one of the most important things that we can do, is realize that it's a thoughtful process and that you should be mentally tired at the end of something, that you're out doing something outside. And so, because you should be thinking about these different things. There are times when we have weather conditions and your group conditions and other things that all come together to make like the perfect situation where you can limit some of that because everything's working together. And especially when you talk about groups, let's say a group of friends, 4 or 5 people doing something. If everyone's looking out for everyone else, it becomes that much easier, right? But if you're the only one thinking about safety and no one else is, that's a hard job. The other part of this is it's an active process. Not only am I thinking about these things, now I have to do something about each of the actions along the way. What have I done to make sure that I've taken care of that particular situation? So an example of that from my Knowles experience was, we were in the mountains, and this is with a student course, not an instructor's course. At the end of these courses, a lot of times we let the students head off on their own for 3 to 4 days. Instructors would go one way, we would plan routes for the students. Important to safety would be communication, so we'd say we're camped X, Y, and Z as we go along, so if you need us, you can come over and get us. A lot of times we would head out early and they would come in behind us, so we were always, I'll say downhill, well, not necessarily, but kind of on the way out of the mountains, they could get to us. Well, in this particular case, all of the snow decided to melt on that Thursday or whatever. It just melted, which meant every stream, river, and otherwise tripled or quadrupled in size. I'd never seen any of these, and I had spent a lot of time in the winds at that time, get this big. So as an instructor team, we were hitting these things first. And we went through a couple of them. We're like, oh, that was a harder crossing, whatever, but we've trained the folks well. We know they'll make good decisions. And then we got to one, we said, this is unsafe. And so when you're in the mountains and you hit river crossings that are unsafe, you can do one thing really well, and that is keep going upstream until it turns into smaller and smaller streams so you can cross them easily, and then come back around the other side. And we thought to ourselves, well, okay, we can do that. Now, will the students do that? I'm not sure. I would hope they would. But the thought that we had, which was most important, was, do they realize, like in my mind, when I'm out there, I go, I may not make a plane, like my plane ticket, because we're heading out. So they all expect to be out on, let's say, Saturday. In my mind, I might not get out Saturday. I might get out Sunday or Monday or Tuesday. But that's okay, I'll take my time to get there. But in their minds, if they're thinking I have to be somewhere, they may make a choice to go quicker than safer. And we thought because of that, so we left one instructor at the camp because we had to have someone at the X where we said we'd be. And then two of us ran between all the three other camps doing all these river crossings to tell them, like, hey, it's really high, and this is where we'll save you time. Go this way instead of that way, and we'll meet you over here. And that's that active part, right? It was one thing for us to recognize the hazard that had happened with the snow melting all at once. It was another thing for us to actually put something engaged and go, okay, this is gonna take some work, but we gotta get out there and go. Has anyone ever read Accidents in North American Mountaineering? Sounds like a good read, huh? Right? The reason I have that up there is because one way of understanding safety, one way of really learning about this stuff is to look at when it went wrong. And it's put out every year, and it's a great way to look at it. Now, it is about mountaineering, so it's specific to that. But what you see is a lot of times the big accident wasn't an instantaneous thing. It was a series of small decisions that led up to something happening later. And so what I want to make sure that you realize is these small decisions, I want you to recognize them. And how do you do that? So let's say you get to the trailhead, you're heading off at about noon or 2 o'clock. Normally you bring a headlamp, but it wasn't where you thought it was, right? You ever have that where you always have it in the fanny pack, or you're always having something, and oh, that's right, I took it out to go see what the dog was doing in the backyard, I forgot to put it back in. Now, you may choose to still go on. It's 2 o'clock, it sunsets at 6 o'clock, no big deal. But what I'm saying is, in these cases, I want you to acknowledge that. I don't have my headlamp, I normally have my headlamp, I need to change my later decisions down the road appropriately. Does that make sense? Right. A lot of times you go, oh, I don't have my headlamp, no problem. And then down the road you go. The instance for me that this really shines through is I have a couple friends that will talk about how if you go hang out with them, everything will be epic. I try to explain to them, it's not a surprise that the sun sets every night. We know that's going to happen. So when you're surprised by it, every time you go out for a hike and go further that way instead of going back to the trailhead, back to your car, that's not magical. You're making a decision to go somewhere else than go back. We have choices to make, and we want to make the right ones. And we have to watch that a series of little small decisions don't lead us into something bigger. Now, we talked about daylight and these small decisions. And to me, this is one that gets overlooked sometimes. Has anyone been benighted, as they call it? Yeah. What happens nothing changes, right? I'm still breathing air, I'm still walking around, but it's dark. What happens though? We're out in the wilderness, we're doing something.
I get a little worried I'm not gonna find a place to sleep. I get a little worried I'm not gonna be able to find a place to sleep.
Find a place to sleep, right?
The people who are expecting you to be back start worrying about you.
You can get other people worried about you. What else?
Your visual landmarks are gone.
Yeah. So what was like, oh, I know where I'm at. And you're like, oh, okay.
Anxieties come up
Yeah.
because, I mean, whether you want to admit it or not, you're nervous. The more you get into that place, the more mistakes you're going to make for sure.
Right.
One thing that happens, you slow down, way down.
Way
You
down.
cannot see.
Right. And it's amazing.
Yeah, you slow way down, so you can't recoup your, you're out too far. You can't just say, well, I'll just get back. You're gonna go way slow. That means you might spend it.
And that's the thing for me that, if you have a headlamp or that kind of stuff, you can still do a lot of stuff. Without that and in the dark, all of a sudden, all these little things become harder. How about that map you had, or seeing the trail, finding your way? Some, trails are around here. We have some great trails, but they also have some turnoffs, and you can easily walk right past that thing that was super visible during the daytime, and you just didn't realize it at night. And so, to me, it's a big deal, and I take it seriously in that I want to make sure that I can still do those things, and I fully understand I slow way down. And there are some things that I could have a lot of problem with if I can't see. So, to some of those friends I talk about, they don't seem to have a big deal with that. They just keep going. Okay. Some factors in wilderness safety. We've mentioned some of these so far. We've got a human factor. The thing that we'll talk about here is that I think about planning for a trip, and you'll see I have a little trip planner coming up here in a second, I consider everything you've done up to that trip as preparation for that trip. So all of your experiences should lead to that. Right? So you have all this outdoor experience, you've done a lot of things. Are you taking that and using it for this next adventure that you're doing? So it's your knowledge and your experience, and I see those as two different things. You can have a lot of knowledge of something, but do you have that experience? And we'll talk about practicing things to increase that experience to match that knowledge. Behaviors. What do I mean by human behaviors?
Patterns or instincts maybe that may not be right in the wilderness.
Yeah, the basic thing is we're unique creatures, right? And we do some weird things sometimes, and we don't always do it exactly, like sometimes we can surprise ourselves. And so we need to make sure that we have that in there. That you mentioned anxiety, right? And so everything can be going well. My anxiety goes up, I get scared, I may no longer act like I was a little bit ago. You're gonna see me in a different situation. And that's important, because if I think that I have a group of 5 people that can all do something, and then I all of a sudden have 2 people that can and 3 people that have become incapacitated, for lack of a better word, I now have to deal with that. So I don't want to get to that point. I want to be doing something ahead of that, keeping that from happening. Communication's a huge one. Communication within your team. You mentioned people being worried for you if you're out. Do you have a plan in place? Now, are you going to do a plan every day when you go out for a hike with the dog? No. But you might have something set up that, just people know that I normally go there, or something like that. Especially if it's a situation where you could, if you're doing 8-mile hikes back into some of these areas, you might want to let people know that you're doing that on a regular basis so that they have some idea where to look for you. We have communications in the idea of our cell phones. We carry them a lot. I use mine a lot. Is that something that can work for you where you're going? When I was teaching at Knowles, I carried a cell phone, and it worked probably 15% of the time, because when I was in the mountains, I had no cell phone coverage. And I would get out, the battery is so bad, like I'd open it up and I'd have like 5 minutes, I could just see the battery and then done. And so It's different nowadays. You get good cell phone coverage, but that kind of communication. Can you communicate out from wherever you're at to ask for help if you need to? There's another part of this, and I'll leave it for a first aid class sometime, but that is, when you do need help, think about your battery running out in 5 minutes, and make sure that you tell them the pertinent things first, and then the extra stuff you can save for later. But if we're at the hospital or somewhere else and we get a call that tells us a bunch of stuff that's not helping us figure out where you're at, not that you call a hospital in this case, and leave out the other stuff, it's hard, right? That's just poor communication in some ways. Gear. We have choices with gear. We need to be making sure that we're making that choice, that the gear fits with what we're doing. I made a poor choice recently with gear. Some friends took me on a river trip. I love water. I'm not a river guide. That's not my expertise. And I should have had something to keep me warm. Things like dry suit, wetsuit, something. I did not. I had sweatpants and weird things. Right. That's how I felt afterwards. Poor decision. I ended up in the water for a period of time. My gear did not help me at all. It hindered me. I actually ended up as that scared person who was incapacitated for a period of time because of a gear decision. I'm comfortable in water. I can swim. I can do all this stuff. But the gear negated all of that. Let's talk about weather and environment. Why do I have them listed differently? Separately.
Weather changes.
Right.
Environment's the same.
So we're choosing both the environment and we're dealing with the weather. And the weather, on one of your resources that I'd hand out there, the National NOAA, is a great weather resource. They can give you some great detailed weather predictions for your area. And now realize that that can change. We all know that, right? It can change every 15 minutes around here. But the environment is something that's important that you're taking into consideration. So going outside now is one choice of environment, a cold, snowy, wet environment. It's kind of that, because when it was snowing, it was about 30 degrees when I was in my car, so it's kind of that wet snow, which we know is different than the dry, cold snow, which we know is different than Southwest when I was hanging out down there and it was just hot, and then cold at night and hot. And so making sure that you're putting those things into context when you're making these decisions to go outside or be active outdoors. Hazards. Talked about a lot of different things. We're talking about wilderness safety. Then we have to have some actual hazards. We want to both identify hazards and then mitigate them. And remember, mitigation is simply dealing with them. How am I avoiding that hazard? So this time of year, what's a hazard we have out there?
Avalanches.
Avalanches. So we've identified avalanches. What are we going to do to mitigate those? So what might we do? I'm not an avalanche guy.
Education.
Right. So let's get education. Understand how we can travel and still deal with that hazard. What else?
You're snowmobiling, not the piloting, not the...
Understanding, again, the travel. How do you travel within that environment? And so you'll see on the resources, I have some great snow science or avalanche resources listed. We, in town here, our avalanche center is an excellent avalanche center. And so they put on some free classes, which is avalanche awareness classes. They also have paid classes by different groups out there. So if that's something that you need to know more about, I want you to get out there and be active in getting that education. Another factor for me that's important is this length of trip. And that changes some things. So if I'm out somewhere and I'm going for the day, so I'm just running around for the day and coming back, that's one thing. But if I'm going for multiple days, and then all of a sudden, if I'm going for, let's say, 6 to 10 days, there's a chance that I'm out somewhere, which I'm a couple days from getting back from. And I want to understand that, because that's a different level of remoteness, right? It's one thing, again, we'll use the M trail. If I crash up on the M trail, for me to get out. One, I have people. There's hopefully someone will walk past me, right? But I also, there's a low distance. But that changes, and my mentality needs to change when I start to deal with that. And one of the things that we looked at when I was an instructor was that as soon as I got a day back, and it was really any time, but I started to really try to emphasize to the groups that I was with that everything we do is important. So your feet are your method out of here if we were hiking, or I've done some horseback trips with friends that have horses. Those horses are arrived. Where are we taking care of our feet, our horses, our transportation, all these different things in a way that we're being thoughtful and making sure that they'll be there when we need them, right? So around here, I may walk around in my backyard barefoot. When I'm on a trip, I may not. I may choose to do different things differently because there's all of a sudden a level of importance. I cut my foot in a certain way and I can't walk on it. By the way, no one ever wants to carry me out of the woods. I don't know why. I've carried people out, but everyone tells me that, my friends mostly say, yeah, Jason, you'll die there. Thanks. Good luck. So I'm extra careful. So we need to make sure that we take that into consideration. That'll come somewhat into it too when we talk about first aid kits, which we'll do here in a minute. Anything else that you want to talk about for factors in wilderness safety?
I would look at a 7-day forecast or 10-day forecast if I was going out for more than a couple of days.
Looking at the forecast with weather, yeah. And again, there are some really good resources for that. And NOAA is one where you can get a really detailed forecast for your particular area. Sorry.
When you talk about length of the trip, sometimes when you're in a group, you're trying to keep up with everybody else, but you're not realizing your own limitations. So you sort of overdo your feelings of whether you should be able to do a 10-mile trip when you really have never done more than 5 miles or whatever it is. So I think sometimes that's a hazard, because then everybody else is going to be starting to take care of you if you're running out of gas.
And I heard two things there. I heard one thing, which is kind of the planning of the trip and making sure everyone's honest, right? Like, hey, this is what we're going to do. You know, like, hey, I haven't done that before. And if the whole group agrees that that's okay, that's one thing, because then you should have people looking out for each other. So that's one side. The other thing is that daily keeping up, right? Because you can be hiking, and if you're the one trying to keep up, you're wearing yourself out, and everyone else is doing fine. And so you can have this situation where you don't want to say, hey, I'm having trouble, yet your ability to cope and deal is decreasing as you go.
Could become a medical problem.
Right, because sometimes what I see there is then people, yeah, go ahead.
No, finish that, I have a different thought.
People sometimes won't drink as much and things like, because what I've seen on the trail, especially with these groups, someone hikes fast, they sit down, they have some drinks, they get some food into them, the other person shows up, they go, okay, let's go, and off they go again, and the person's like, I just got there, come on. And so we let some of those things, and we don't look out as a group, and that comes back to that idea that we should be thinking about everyone, not just ourselves. We should look and go, because in order for me to succeed on whatever I'm trying that day, I got to make sure everyone else can come along if I decide to go with a group.
I was just thinking that the BWAGs is a local group, and you come together, a lot of women every Tuesday and go out hiking, and some women you know well and some you don't. And some things I've noticed is not everybody has like the roadid.com, or we've had where someone had an accident. Fortunately, someone else knew who to contact for a family member.
Right.
Otherwise, I don't even know this woman's last name. We also don't know if they have any safety issues or concerns. And one woman has a heart condition, and if her heart starts bothering her, she just lies down. But she doesn't tell somebody, I'm going to lie down here, and then you guys come back. And it's like, well, what if you don't? You know, oh, it always goes away. Well, I don't want to hike with that person again.
Right.
You know? Something as simple, if you're with people that you don't know, something like a roadid.com, that's going to give people at least a last name, a date of birth, who to contact if there's something that goes on.
Yeah, and that, to me, that's one of the differences too between this the commercial mentality. So when I was running trips for Knowles, I read I got a medical sheet and I read every one of them, and I had it all marked up, and I had that with me so that I knew exactly what I had to think about for each person medically. But that's not the same when you're out with friends. But you should think about those things. So whatever, 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Every trip I go on, I tell people, this is what I have, this is what could happen. I haven't had a low blood sugar, that's not my problem. But I never know. If I'm out there, it's cold water, I didn't get a chance to eat properly, these couple things, I may end up in a situation I haven't before, and I want them to know, like, just don't roll me over the boat or whatever. Give me a little sugar and I should be fine. It's all about me.
I have a comment on that.
Oh, yeah.
So when you're talking about length of your trip, my husband has lots of good stories. Unfortunately, he's not here, but if you hike with, especially guys hiking alone, they'll never really say their experience level, and especially if they're young, they're like, oh yeah, I'm young, I'm strong, I can do this. But a lot of times they don't know how to prepare, so they've got the wrong kind of shoes on, they have lots of heavy stuff in their backpack, and so the length of the trip gets a lot longer because they can't hike very fast, and you end up having to take stuff out of their packs, and so.
Right, the time frame, like,
Yeah,
you're gonna go this, it normally takes so many hours to get there.
It took until almost midnight, and people were trying to pick them up, but there are just lots of stories like that where they can hardly walk because their shoes weren't right, and they have blisters after a while. And they were the young, strong people in the group, whereas my husband was older, but he was a lot wiser and he knew how to hike, so he was trying to help all these young people that really didn't know they didn't know.
Right. And to me, that again, that comes back to education and stuff. Sometimes, like I did a lot of that at Knowles, and saying, you know what, I know you've got a ton of energy or whatever, but one of the things you need, especially if you are, to me, if you're any part of a group, but when I was leading groups, I had to be able to come into camp knowing that I had to have all the same amount of energy I just used again, because I might have to take care of someone medically. I might have to, right? I have to keep going. I can't expend all of my energy and collapse at camp, because I got to look around and say, what else do I need to do? So let's look at wilderness safety pre, during, and post-trip. So some things, again, all of your experiences in training can lead into being prepared for the safety of this trip. So what have you done ahead of this? Information about that area and its hazards. So if you're changing your environment, if you're going to the Southwest or whatever, finding out information about that, what are the things that you should be concerned about? How do you deal with those things? Your gear choices. You might have to change your gear to be appropriate for that trip. I wish I had a dry suit. Medical and rescue resources. I always look at, especially if I'm going to a new area, like when we went up to the Bob on a horse trip, I looked and said, well, where's the nearest hospital? How big is that hospital? How would I get to them? Well, how might I call? Go ahead.
What do you recommend if you don't have cell phone coverage or an emergency locator or GPS or, emergency notification?
Right. Good question. I don't have a necessary recommendation for something. So what you mentioned was there are some different things, and let's talk about that. I have a section on technology. It's kind of there, but we'll add it in there and we'll talk in more detail. Does that work? Okay. And so, is there a rescue group in the area? How would I contact them? How does that work? And then again, we're to this part about participant medical conditions. And again, I'm not talking about commercial trips. I'm simply talking about you going out with some friends. I need to know so that we can do it as a group. During the trip, we talked about this decision awareness, making sure that you're voicing, hey, we made a decision, we're moving forward, we forgot all our headlamps, or we didn't bring matches, I don't know. But something, we're choosing to go forward, make sure the rest of our decisions take that into consideration. This energy and proper hydration is really important because you need to keep, the people are what's going in this group, and you have to make sure that they're doing well, right? And that hydration we can often forget about, but it's so important in my mind, is the overall wilderness safety. I've had situations when I've been in canyons where we were drinking, the water we had access to were in the cow tanks, and it kind of tasted like cow spit, but it was water. And I really was excited to drink water. Not everyone in my course was. They kept telling me, oh, I'm drinking. And I was watching them like, you're not looking good anymore. And I found out that about 3 or 4 of them had just stopped drinking water. And that doesn't work, as we all know, right? And so you gotta catch that early. Post-trip. Here's a couple things that I think are really important. Evaluate what you did. Learn from that. Hey, this went really well. I really liked how that worked. That didn't. I am not gonna make this poor decision again about wearing sweatpants and stupid stuff on a river trip. I will either not get on the boat or have a dry suit wetsuit. Make some accurate evaluation of your actions and decisions. And then this restock. If you have a repair kit, restock it. If you use something to repair the tent, to this, to that, restock it. Because that's the thing that you like, oh, I know it's in there, then you open it up and you're like, it's not there anymore. Same thing with that first aid kit. Make sure that if you used anything, get them back in. Okay, real quick about practicing skills. To me, there's skills out there. These are just 3. There's hundreds of skills. But what I want to emphasize to you is find ways to practice those things that you're going to need to actually be safe. River crossing is an important one to me because especially when you get deeper in the woods and you don't have a bridge to cross, this skill is important. The water changes, you want to be able to do it safely. What's hard is you have to find a way to do that. An example of this is on one course, I just saw this setup where there was a lot of strong water up here. It was about waist deep. And then I had a really long section of run out, I'll call it, about mile or so, where we could pick up people if they ended up falling up here. And I put some people in place with sticks and ways to rescue people out of the water. And then we spent 6 hours between the group of us. I built a fire to deal with the cold and wet, practicing every way we need to cross the river. Have you seen books and they say like, hey, let's make that giant circle? Has everyone ever seen that river crossing? Giant circle and rotate through the river, right? I remember reading that and I'm like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. It was my favorite that day. I had no idea until I tried it. And that's the one thing that you get from practicing some of this stuff, is you get to go, oh, real experience. Like that actually worked better than I thought. There were some other methods that didn't work as well. And so the problem with this is a lot of times, these are rough environments, right? I've seen people practice river crossing in ankle deep water. I'm like, well, you're not really practicing. All you're doing is walking around in the water. And so you actually have to, it's a very thoughtful process to set these things up. Same thing if you know of ice axe arrest, or a lot of times if you're in the mountain mountaineering, you can carry an ice axe as you're hiking along, with the idea that if you slip on a steep slope, that you can arrest. Well, you should practice that before you get there. And the only way to do that is to find these safe slopes in order to do that, or otherwise you have to find run out and ways to do that. You can pay people to take you out to practice. Beacon searches is one for avalanche. You can do tons of searching with your beacon, not in an avalanche. You can do it other places. Practice that because that skill needs to be right there for you. And it's really important that you're ready to do it. We're going to talk about 2 more things in the last 10 minutes. Wilderness navigation, real briefly, and then first aid training. Both things play into wilderness safety. So the navigation, this comes to that technology that you're talking about. And so I want you to have the right mindset. When I was working for Knowles, we had some of the first public accessible GPS, thank you. Maybe too much cough medicine today. And so the way I looked at it was I had this GPS and I was proving whether or not it was right. That's the mindset I want you to go into some of this stuff with. Because a lot of times we take it and go, this is magical and it will save me and it'll get where I need to go. Which some of these things are pretty cool and they are magical. But if we think that it's going to take care of us, then we're missing the one part, which is we have to make sure when it stops working because the batteries run out, the cold takes it out, whatever, or we still have that knowledge to deal with it. And so I want you to use this technology. There's amazing technology out of GPS and otherwise, but also be thinking about that you're always making sure that it's right? So I'm always double checking that. There are limitations to technology. We talked about that. Batteries, cold, different things have limitations on that. It would be nice if you knew all those before you went out, but sometimes you find out in the middle. So that means that having that mindset above can help you through some of that. And then finally, the foundations of navigation to me, there's map skills, and then there's travel skills, two different things. I want to understand how to read a map, and when I read a map, I start from the beginning. So a lot of times people think like, just throw me anywhere in the woods, give me a map, and I should be able to figure out where I'm at. Now, there's some truth to that, right? I can do some figuring. But one of the best things is when I leave, I know where I started. And as I go along, I'm just marking off, hey, yeah, I know I'm here now I'm here. And I'm making sure that I understand where I'm at as I move through that map. And that's important. There's the terrain and travel skills, which is, I don't need a map to travel in the backcountry, I just walk. But I need to make sure that I understand terrain. A lot of times when I'll go to a new place, I'll look at the map and I'll say that there's a river here, there's a ridge there. Don't go over the ridge, don't cross the river, and I'll be somewhere where I want to go, right? Like, I can use those big picture of understanding my terrain to let me navigate and travel easier. So it's not all about running around looking at the map, but it's understanding these different things. I know REI does some classes on backcountry travel and map reading and stuff like that. I have them on that list. On the bottom, and rightfully so, there's compass skills. Because you can do a lot of stuff with these top three and not need anything else. Compass skills comes in for some other stuff, for a little, in my mind, a little advanced, and some fun stuff with that. But that compass skills then, to me, also goes right up to that technology, because that technology, those GPS units and other things, can do some of that same stuff. Yeah?
So what is a travel skill? I know what a map skill is, but
Right.
what were you referring to with travel skills?
So travel skills is when I'm out there making choices of how to travel. So if I was in the canyons, there's a lot of canyons. Right down in the bottom, there's tons of willows and everything else. And so I may choose to travel slightly off the bottom of something. It's that idea of that I'm taking into consideration my terrain around me and how I'm going to move through it. So it may not be a direct line. There's a thing called contouring when you're a mountain. You stay at the same level. And when I hike with people and they go down and someone goes up, I'm like, you're not contouring anymore. Let's go around this way. They're silly things that I'm talking about right now, but they are about the travel skills. It's how I move through the wilderness. And that can play a part into this navigation. Because I can look at the map and I can say I want to go over there. And I can go to the bottom, to the drainage and back up the other side, or I could make a big loop around. And I'm going to make a choice of what I think might be easiest for me in the group. That leads us to first aid. And that's a true statement there. There's when I was looking up wilderness safety, one organization came up in Virginia. They're called Wilderness Safety, and they teach first aid. And to me, first aid is what you need after the fact. Now, there's a lot of first aid that plays into what we mentioned before with like hyperthermia, hypothermia, those things, because part of first aid is prevention. So I want to talk about in this class two things. I want to talk about who has first aid training? Okay, great. So you may not need this, but I'm going to quickly go over this. First aid versus wilderness first aid. Wilderness first aid, anything with wilderness is going to have some improvisation skills. So it's one thing to have a cravat so that I can put someone's arm in a sling, another thing to take someone's t-shirt and use that. And one of the things that you're going to hear me say when I talk about this little section here is it's always someone else's something. I don't give up. You need me to be healthy to take care of you if I'm the one taking care of you. So I use your shirt and your backpack and your stuff to do that. Wilderness first aid versus wilderness first responder. They're both the wilderness courses. First aid is basically mostly 2-day courses. There's some 3-day courses with it, and it's generalized first aid. First responder, that was a term that was used before without wilderness on it, and it means all those folks that we first responded. So your police, fire, other folks that weren't necessarily the medical trained, but if they first arrived on the scene, what would they do? And so it's a little higher level, but it's still without a bunch of stuff. These next two, well, this bottom one is stuff. And so the difference for these two, it's either a 2-day course or an 8 to 10-day course. And that Wolfer, to me, when you're talking about wilderness training, medical training, that's probably one of the best courses. It really has everything you need. There is a wilderness EMT, but once you move into the EMT course, that's all our folks riding the ambulances and taking care of you via the ambulance. They're either EMT or paramedic, and that is the difference between the first responder and that EMT is that they learn to use oxygen and backboards and splint types and all this stuff, which you don't have in the wilderness. And then you'll see out there this EMR. It used to be called first responder, but recently, nationally, they changed some terminology, and so now they're called emergency medical responders and emergency medical technicians. Which brings us to talking about first aid kits, because this is an important part of safety and having that. So first of all, back in the day, I would have told you always make your own kit because there were no good commercial kits. That is no longer true. There are some great commercial kits out there. A lot of different companies make them. You have to look in, figure out which one you like, and you can find them at any of our outdoor stores here. Second, what's the perfect kit? Well, the perfect kit is one that you can use. So what is your training to use? Which brings me to somewhere in here, can you use it? I've seen people make kits of a bunch of stuff that they don't know how to use. So who's it for? You know, if you've never used a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope, you shouldn't have that in there. So think about those kind of things. To me, one of the other random thoughts here is that OTC is over-the-counter meds, so I can buy ibuprofen and Tylenol and that stuff. And sometimes I've seen people take one pill bottle and they put, oh, I've got my ibuprofen, I put my Tylenol and this and that in there. And as soon as you do that, you no longer truly know what those different things are. But you may, right? You might, like, I always know the brown ones are these and the white ones are those, but no one else does. So if I opened up your kit to help out and saw that, I'd be like, I'm not giving you anything out of that. Like, I have no idea. So the reason I mention that there is, one of the things you get from those commercial kits is you get small packages. It seems wasteful because there's one square of paper with 2 pills in it, right? It's like, but you know exactly what those pills are. And they also tell you the directions. Take this every 4 hours or whatever. So you have all the things you need on that. The other way to look at it is you could just buy some small bottles. But I recommend keeping that packaging. That restock and recheck is so important. When you use stuff out of it, make sure you're restocking and then recheck the different things to make sure that they're not outdated, that's still usable. I've gone into my kit sometimes, I'm like, I must have bought these pills in the 60s or something. They're all gooey in there and nasty. So in conclusion, safety doesn't happen by accident. I had to use that. And that it's a thoughtful process, it's an active process, and the preparation and planning matters. There's a saying, I think it came through Knowles, but plan ahead and prepare. But the other one that I like is piss poor performance. Prior planning prevents piss poor performance. I started at the end.
Proper plan.
And so that does matter. Okay. You guys have sheets of all these resources, and since I'm at my time limit, that stuff's on the sheets. There's different things that are there. There are great resources. There's a ton more. I wasn't able to put them all out there. But thank you again for spending some time with me.
Thank you.